separation of church and state. The First Amendment has worked remarkably well throughout American history for people of faith.
Welcome to this episode of Dangerous Dogma. We'll have our guest, Randall Balmer, in just a moment. But first, I want to introduce what we're doing with a three-part special series looking at evangelicalism and issues of controversy and evolution within the evangelical world over the last several decades. This series is a special partnership with Moravian Seminary, and I'm joined today with a guest host, Jared Burkholder of Moravian Seminary. Jared, tell us about yourself and your role there at Moravian.
Thanks, Brian. I have the privilege of serving as a temporary scholar in residence at Moravian Seminary. And we should mention that we have Lindsay Scott to thank for setting up these podcasts. Lindsay is Director of Strategic Programs, Lifelong Learning, and the Doctor of Ministry programs there at the seminary. And Brian, you and Lindsay have worked together before. The two of you kind of set up these podcasts and made connections with the guests and then invited me along for the ride. So I appreciate that. And the theme ties in with a lecture that I'll be giving at the end of the month there at Moravian Seminary on issues related to evangelicalism.
Yeah, we'll talk about your lecture a little bit, but it is important, I think, Jared, just that we note, because these topics are sensitive at the place where you have a permanent affiliation. So for anyone that isn't familiar with Dangerous Dogma, I'll just say that on this podcast, we allow people to speak for themselves and not necessarily for everyone in the conversation. And so I'm really excited, though, that we had this opportunity to speak with Randall Balmer. He is a leading historian in the study of religion in American life. He has a brand new book out that we spoke with him about that is fantastic. America's Best Idea: The Separation of Church and State. And so we talk with Randall about that book, about church-state separation, about the evolution, the growth of the religious right in the evangelical world. And so let's hop into it. I think people will really enjoy this conversation. Randall, first of all, welcome back to Dangerous Dogma.
Glad to be here. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's always exciting to talk with you, and we're especially excited to have you as part of our special mini-series on thinking about the evolution of evangelicalism. And I want to kind of start us thinking about some things that we kind of take for granted today that would have been really surprising a half century ago. So, for instance, last November, 8 out of 10 white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, and none of us were surprised by that. And yet, if you would travel back in time 40, 50 years and announce 8 out of 10 white evangelicals are voting for one party, and particularly voting for the Republican Party, and I'm not even talking about getting into like the character issues involved, just that 8 out of 10 are voting for Republicans, that would have surprised the 1970s version of yourself and any other historians and people active in that time period. So let's start there. What happened?
Well, yeah, it's good. I mean, I'd go back even farther to set the context here and to say that in my judgment, for half a century, and I kind of bracket it, somewhat in a forced way, bracket it by saying the Scopes trial in 1925 and Jimmy Carter's campaign for the presidency in 1975. Those are somewhat artificial bookends, but they're fairly accurate. And that is to say that during that half century, evangelicals were not politically active, certainly not organized. And I say this in part from personal experience. I mean, I grew up, as you know, firmly embedded in what I call the evangelical subculture through the 1970s. And many evangelicals were not even registered to vote in those decades. And to set that context historically, part of it was we were so fixated with the end of time, the imminent return of Jesus. My father was an evangelical minister. He preached about this, very frequently, particularly on Sunday evenings. And these prophecy sermons were so fixated with the imminent end of the world. Well, if you take that and tease out the implications of that, the corollary is that why are we worried about this world? We're worried about the next world. We're trying to get ready to meet Jesus when he returns in the air, to use the very familiar phrase at that time. So again, my larger point is that there was very little political involvement, and I'll involve myself in this narrative as well. I remember going to Trinity College, Deerfield, Illinois, which sadly closed a couple of years ago, in the fall of 1972, and I was very interested in politics, and I tried to get my classmates interested in politics, and there was just they weren't. I mean, they kind of had a default support for Richard Nixon, but there was not much energy behind it, not much passion behind it, and I was trying to kind of get them revved up, and in my naivete, I thought, well, if we evangelicals get involved in politics, we are certainly going to list toward the political left, because that's part of our heritage as evangelicals. Going back into the 19th and early 20th century, evangelicals were very much involved in various issues, including women's rights, women's equality, the rights of workers to organize, the support for public education as a way of trying to elevate the status of those on the lower rungs of society. And I'll cut short my answer at this point, just to say that as the 1970s unfolded, it didn't unfold in ways that I thought that it would in the fall of 1972. So that's the larger background, and then we can talk about the 1970s if you want to in particular. But I'll let you lead the questioning on that.
Sounds good. We had really enjoyed working through your latest book, Randall, America's Best Idea, Separation of Church and State. And I wonder if you might start out talking a little bit about the title for the book.
Sure.
And why is that perhaps a surprising title for maybe evangelicals to have for this audience?
Sure, that's great. Well, the title, I have to sort of apologize to Ken Burns. Ken Burns thinks that the national parks are America's best idea. And with all my deference and respect for Ken Burns, because I think he's really a brilliant filmmaker, I have to disagree. I think America's best idea is the First Amendment and the separation of church and state. And I think it's America's best idea because it's worked so well from both sides. That is to say, I think if you take the two principal figures that I would associate with the First Amendment, the first would be Roger Williams, the founder of the Baptist tradition in America, and the second would be Thomas Jefferson, who of course was the third president of the United States, who wrote his famous letter to the Danbury Baptists on New Year's Day, 1802, in which he announced his support for that act of the whole American people, which I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have the quote in front of me, which established the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, thereby setting up the separation of church and state. Again, that's not an exact quote. And I think it's fair to say that Roger Williams' concern was concern about protecting the integrity of the faith from too close an association with the state. Jefferson, of course, the creature of the Enlightenment, I think was more interested in preserving the integrity of the government from religious factionalism and religious contestation. And I think the beauty of the First Amendment is that it's done both. For more than 200 years, it has shielded the government from religious contestation. And at the same time, it has shielded the integrity of the faith from government interference. And so that's why I think it's America's best idea. And from a perspective of evangelicals or religious people in general, I'm not feigning disbelief here. I'm genuinely perplexed that so many people on the religious right want to undermine America's best idea, the First Amendment. I am genuinely perplexed about this. And particularly for evangelicals, evangelicals have competed in this free marketplace of religion set up by the First Amendment better than any other group throughout American history. Go back to George Whitefield and the open air preaching, the itinerants of the First Great Awakening, the circuit riders, the colporteurs in the 19th century, the urban revivalists, people like Billy Sunday and Billy Graham in the 20th century, and more recently, suburban style megachurches that looked like shopping centers. I mean, these evangelicals know how to speak the idiom of the culture, I think, better than any other religious group throughout American history. And why leaders of this movement would seek to undermine the First Amendment is, to me, a matter of great perplexity. And I'm not ginning this up for effect. I'm genuinely baffled by this. This is, again, America's best idea, and the the kernel of truth behind it, I think, is this free marketplace of religion. And as you know in the book, I talk about Adam Smith's great treatise, his defense of free market capitalism, the Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. And one of his examples is religion. He says, if government stays out of religion, religion is going to flourish. And all you have to do, I think, is compare the United States and our record in terms of religious fidelity and religious affiliation. I'm not saying anything about the quality of religious life in America. That's a different conversation. But in terms of quantity, we're off the charts. Compare that to Great Britain, for example. Now, the last I checked, and this was probably 30 years ago, less than 3% of the population in Great Britain attended the state church, the Church of England, on any given Sunday. I expect it's probably half that, if that, today. And that's an example of how this free marketplace of religion, set up by the First Amendment, has worked, I think, so well throughout American history.
Yeah, I share your like this is disbelief. This wild to see people trying to undo something that's so great. Although I guess we're living in a time where the administration is both trying to undo what you think is America's best idea and what Ken
Yeah.
Burns thinks is America's best idea.
Yeah, that's
We're
true.
we're both under attack.
Yeah, we should
But so I wanted to
join
ask
forces.
as a Baptist, I have to say I really love how well at least Baptists show up in your book. There's a part where you write America needs more Baptists, real
Yes.
traditional Baptists, and so
Right.
I was hard to make amening to that. But I do think that's worth talking about because it is a surprise now to a lot of people to hear when I go and talk for separation of church and state, and I even serve on the national board right now of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And
Oh, good
as
for you. Yeah.
a Baptist minister, people are sometimes surprised about that. And so I'm always talking about Roger Williams and John Leland and Isaac Backus and all these figures that show up so well in your book. And one of the things I love about your book is how accessible. I mean, it's a short read. It's a good read. I mean, this is something that any Christian could pick up and really get a sense of the story and the evolution and the history. But then later in your book, you also now get us that story of what happened. And I think that's really important. This idea of like what happened to Baptists, because that line that you have about Baptists is actually about Roy Moore in that particular chapter, who is a Baptist, right? And so
no, he's not.
I mean,
He's not. I'm sorry, he's not.
Baptist.
He claims to be a Baptist.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. No Baptist would engage in that nonsense, that chicanery. I mean, no real Baptist. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, so the moment this will come out in a couple of weeks, but the moment that we're talking is the day after the White House has just announced their America Prays initiative, that they're trying to get Americans to gather together in groups of 10 and pray for an hour every week between now and next 4th of July as part of the 250th anniversary celebrations. There's only
I missed that somehow. I don't
on the list of endorsers, and it's the Southern Baptist Convention. Although it turns out only I checked in on that. Only the SBC president actually signed on. He doesn't really have the authority to sign the entire nomination on, but the White House doesn't understand Baptist policy.
So much for congregationalism,
right? But I mean, that's the moment we're in, where Southern Baptists today lead the effort against church-state separation in so many ways. So tell us a little bit of that story, because it's so significant for the moment we live in.
I think it is. You're absolutely right. And again, I think when historians, if we make it this far, when historians look back on, say 50 years from now, look back on the the last century, I think the 1970s is going to be so crucial. So much happens in the 1970s. As you know, the religious right gets going, and as you know from my work, and I think others as well, the real catalyst was not any sign of kind of high-minded defense of religious freedom or opposition to abortion. The real catalyst was the defense of racial segregation at places like Bob Jones University, and I think that's now fairly well established. But the other thing that happens in the 1970s, coincident with the rise of the religious right in the late 1970s, is that many white evangelicals, and I think we have to add that modifier here, many white evangelicals begin to look around and say, look, we are losing somehow. And they're not, certainly. And I think one of the reasons for the success of the religious right is that the leaders of the movement really cultivated this rhetoric of victimization and marginalization. That is to say, we're under attack. Our values are under attack. It's preposterous in the larger scheme, a 40,000-foot view of the situation to give any credence to that sort of rhetoric. But it was very, very effective in marshaling voters to the polls in 1980, for example. So I think, and again, as a historian, I want to look back at the larger context. I think the larger context for that probably was the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, or also known as the Immigration Act, that did away with immigration quotas. And when Lyndon Johnson signed that legislation at the foot of the Statue of Liberty on Liberty Island in New York Harbor, he said something to the effect, this is not going to really change very much in how America looks, or there's not going to be many repercussions from this act. And Johnson was usually pretty prescient about many things. He was wrong on that issue. That is to say, I think the Immigration Act of 1965 was really, really transformative. Not immediately, but as these barriers began to come down and immigrants began to arrive from particularly Asia and Southeast Asia, it utterly and literally, and I don't use that modifier lightly, transformed the religious landscape in America. And I'm old enough to see this happen. That is to say, there are Sikh Gurdwaras and Buddhist stupas and Hindu temples and Shinto shrines in places I never would have imagined when I was a child growing up in the middle decades of the 20th century. And it's precisely because, or at least it's one of the repercussions of the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. Well, let's fast forward to the late 1970s as the religious right is beginning to get its sea legs. They're beginning to see, that is, white evangelicals are beginning to see, wait a minute, we are no longer the hegemonic force in American society, in American culture that we once were, or at least we thought we were. And so they begin to respond to this rhetoric of victimization. And so, which, by the way, I think, again, I'm jumping ahead, but this rhetoric of victimization is one of the reasons that they embraced Donald Trump beginning in 2016, because he speaks the rhetoric of victimization better than anyone I've ever seen in my life. It's always about him, of course. He's always the victim, but I think there was some sort of almost visceral connection with Trump because of this vocabulary of marginality and victimization. I'm sorry, let's go back to the 1970s. So when the conservatives take over the Southern Baptist Convention in 1979, for example, that is when they begin to drop their historic defense of the First Amendment and the separation of church and state. You only have to go back to George Washington Truett in the 1920s. He has this huge rally on the steps of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., in which he offers this full-throated defense of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state, liberty of conscience. And he also says, echoing John Leland, and I think this is an important point as well. I'm sorry, I'm getting all over the place, but I'll try to bring it back together, that religious freedom is different from religious toleration. And that is also a very crucial Baptist point. And Leland makes that, I think, emphatically back in the late 18th century. That is to say, it's one thing to talk about religious freedom. It's another thing to talk about religious toleration. I'm willing to tolerate you and your beliefs, the way you worship and how you order your lives. That is condescending. That's a whole different matter from religious freedom, which is a full-throated defense of religious diversity. So again, back to the late 1970s, the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention very quickly morphs into an abandonment of one of these bedrock Baptist principles defending the wall of separation between church and state. And I think it's, the larger picture here is that they wanted to change the rules in their favor. That is to say, throughout American history, as we talked about already, evangelicals in particular have been very, very effective at competing in this marketplace of religion in the United States. All of a sudden, late 1970s, they begin to say, oh, wait a minute, we're maybe not so effective any longer. Let's change the rules in our favor. And this, of course, has had all sorts of very nasty consequences, culminating now in all this rhetoric about Christian nationalism, posting the Ten Commandments in public places. And by the way, Ten Commandments, these are supposed to be Christian. Ten Commandments? I mean, if they really want to post Christian principles in public schools, why not go with the Beatitudes or Matthew 25? But I'm getting off topic here, I'm afraid. All you guys need to do is press my buttons and I get going. I'm sorry about that. I'll try to rein myself in a little bit.
We'll be right back with the rest of this conversation with Randall Balmer. But first of all, we wanted to pause and let you know that this episode is being brought to you in partnership with Moravian Theological Seminary. And Jared will be presenting the annual Moses Lecture on October 29th at 4 p.m. at the Bahnsen Center on the Bethlehem campus of Moravian Theological Seminary. And it will also be live streamed, so people can sign up either in person or to watch online. You can find more information in the description below or in the show notes at dogma.wardenway.org. Jared, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about as you're preparing for this year's Moses Lecture?
That would be great. So as we've been talking about, and as you know, questions about evangelical identity have been center stage since 2016. But honestly, decades before that, even since the 1980s, evangelicals have been kind of hashing it around themselves about what this means. So I'm going to be diving into that a little bit. Many of our listeners may not know about the Moravian Church, but this church has a fascinating history, and they've kind of weaved their way in and out of the evangelical movement over the years, as many smaller denominations have. So at the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the Moravian Church and that evangelical question.
Very good. People can go sign up for that to watch in person or online. And now back to our conversation with Randall Balmer.
I know this is a big question maybe, but just in real general terms, what are some of the main ways that evangelicals might defend their Christian nationalism, or even some of the historical nuggets that you have in the book that evangelicals would interpret as supporting Christian nationalism?
I hate to give any of these guys any oxygen whatsoever, but I guess you have to refute them. And a lot of this, as you know, I mean, you guys are good historians. You know this as well as I do. That this is just bad history. I mean, it's not history at all. It's fabulism on the part of these people trying to invent this American past. David Barton says something like 53 out of the 55 founders were evangelical. I mean, it's preposterous. I mean, I like to say that with a very possible exception of John Witherspoon, the Presbyterian minister and president of the College of New Jersey, and Benjamin Rush, a physician, none of the founders would be welcome as members in any of the congregations now advocating for Christian nationalism. I mean, it's just preposterous. I mean, Benjamin Franklin. I mean, come on, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, it's just preposterous. So where are they getting this stuff? I guess they're getting it from people like Barton. And I think you refute it on three grounds. I mean, and I'm not sure I'm really answering your question, but if I'm not, please redirect me. I think you do it on theological or biblical grounds, first of all. You do it on historical grounds, and there's a wealth of evidence there that refutes Christian nationalism. And then the final argument would be the one that we've already made, or I've already made, that it's pragmatic. That is to say, the notion of the separation of church and state, contrary to Christian nationalism, has worked very well for the integrity of the faith throughout American history. But getting back to the first thing, the theological, biblical grounds, yes, you have ancient Israel, which is a theocracy, sure. I understand that. But, again, we're Christians, and the New Testament, I think, is a little closer to what we want to aspire to. At least I do. Uh, Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Let's go home. I mean, that pretty much settles the argument, it seems to me. You also have this thing about rendering to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's, and we can debate about what that means, how we should interpret that. But at least it talks about two different realms, it seems to me, the realm of God and the realm of Caesar. And historical grounds, again, I just referenced this notion that the founders were evangelical Christians, which is preposterous. The First Amendment itself, I think, the text of the First Amendment is pretty clear grounds for refuting any notion of Christian nationalism. The founders never intended Christianity to be the state religion. And I think the background for understanding that, too, was the religious diversity in the colonies. When I teach my course on religion in North America, I put up a map of the Atlantic seaboard and ask the students to identify the religious groups that are settling in each colony. And it's extraordinary, the diversity. I mean, you have Swedish Lutherans in what is now Delaware, for example. You got Dutch Reformed in New Amsterdam. You've got French Huguenots. You've got Puritans, later Congregationalists. You've got Anglicans. You've got Moravians. You've got, this extraordinary diverse Roman Catholics, English Catholics, Spanish Catholics. And the question is, how are you going to accommodate all that? And the founders wisely just chose not to designate any one faith as the state religion. The separation of church and state, the First Amendment has worked remarkably well throughout American history for people of faith, for religious folks. And to try to undermine that for whatever reason, it seems to me, is terribly, terribly short-sighted.
Randall, you mentioned a lot of the religious diversity in the colonies before, and one thing I found interesting in the book is the way you were kind of riffing off of the tension between a majoritarian kind of mentality versus a mentality that looks out for religious minorities, which one could argue that the concept of religious freedom is really designed to protect religious minorities more than to protect the majority if they feel like their position is slipping somehow. And you mentioned
Right.
that before as well. I grew up with some experience within the Anabaptist tradition, which
Right.
we find originally in the 18th century among that diversity within colonial America. And we see things like the Sermon on the Mount sort of being a canon within the canon, emphasized the peace ethic, a radical peace ethic that many evangelicals might be surprised about.
Yeah.
And there was the assumption that in order to really live out the ideals of Jesus, you had to have separation of church and state.
Sure.
The government was going to coerce you into fighting its
Sure.
beliefs. And there's a lot of coercion within any kind of state government. And so I don't know if you could talk a bit about Anabaptists or other of those smaller
Sure.
religious groups, Quakers, Moravians, even
Sure.
at all.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I know it's a great question and a great point. And I think, I'm sure there's a lot of people think otherwise about me, of me, but I consider myself a patriot. Not in the sense of flag waving or wearing silly red hats or things like that, but I'm a patriot in the sense, in my sense, that America's charter documents eschewed majoritarianism and looked out for the rights of minorities. Now, I have to acknowledge in the next breath, or the same breath, that we Americans have been far, far too slow in realizing those ideals or living up to those ideals. Certainly in the case of women's equality, people of color, absolutely. We've been far, far too slow. But there is a kind of arc, what Theodore Parker and Martin Luther King talked about, the arc of the moral universe. There is a kind of arc in American history that sees us gradually but steadily living up to those ideals. Now, I think that arc is slowed right now. I even see evidence that it's beginning to bend back around the other direction. But over the long haul of American history, that has been the arc of our common life, is to acknowledge and to recognize the rights of minorities. The problem with majoritarianism is that it's essentially fascist. I mean, there's not a pretty word for it. That is to say, you go down to a local community and you have people in, let's say, I don't know, Ottawa, Illinois. I don't know why I chose that, but it just came to my mind. Ottawa, Illinois. And they determined in the school district, well, the majority of us are Christians here in Ottawa, or at least claim to be Christians. Therefore, we should have Christian ideals as part of our common life, including in the public school system, including in public displays in the town square or wherever it might be. That's majoritarianism. And the founders were very clear that they did not want that. Roger Williams was very clear that he dissented against the majoritarian ethic of Puritan New England, Puritan Massachusetts, which is what gets kicked out of the colony. So majoritarianism, I think, is inimical to America's founding documents. And so as you're talking about the Anabaptists, and the 18th century was not easy for Anabaptists. You had the 7 Years' War, you had the American Revolution, they were pacifists along with Quakers and others. And, they had to somehow exist. And it wasn't easy. And they were persecuted. But, again, as part of this longer arc of American history, eventually Americans came to see that, no, it wasn't right to impose excise taxes on pacifists as they did in the 18th century. But it's a slow process, but that's been the general trajectory throughout American history.
So, as we've talked a lot about the things that have been changing, one of the things that you talk about in your book is what's often called the Johnson Amendment, or, it's I guess the official IRS term is the political campaign activity ban. But we like to, British right wants to demonize Johnson. So they try to, build it up like it was some secret, Lyndon Johnson plot to, in fact, President Trump has even claimed, he rewrites the story and says that, Johnson was having a battle with this, prominent pastor in Houston, and they didn't like each other. And that's why this whole, none of which is true. The churches weren't actually the target of this. So you talk about it because this is something that, the Trump administration, a lot of evangelicals today are working to get rid of. How does this actually protect church-state separation? How does it protect the government, protect the houses of worship?
It does. I mean, and I think when we talk about the Johnson Amendment, we have to acknowledge from off the bat that Johnson was acting out of self-interest. I don't think there's any question about that. There were various conservative forces who were allying against him as he was seeking re-election in 1954. And he introduced this amendment to prohibit tax-exempt organizations from engaging in the endorsement or the attack on political candidates. So he was acting out of self-interest. There's no question about that. I'm not going to debate that. It's abundantly clear. That doesn't mean it's not a good idea. I think it's a very good idea not to have taxpayers supporting overt partisan political activity. And I think to understand this, you have to reckon with the fact that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. I don't think I need to debate this, but let's put it out there, right? I'm an ordained Episcopal minister. I had a church parish back in Connecticut, in a rather affluent town. Our church did not pay property taxes, even though the church itself occupied probably the best parcel in town. Uh, and so it meant that the other people of Washington, Connecticut had to pony up extra for public parks, police services, fire protection, and so forth. So tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. And all the Johnson Amendment asked was that in exchange for that public subsidy, these tax exempt organizations forswear political endorsements. Now, for nearly 3/4 of a century, well, at least half a century, most religious organizations, tax exempt organizations, have figured this is a pretty good deal. We get this taxpayer subsidy. All we have to do is not make political endorsements. Well, that begins to change again late in the 1970s with the rise of the religious right. And all of a sudden you hear this rhetoric, this is an impingement on our religious freedom. I can't say the word I want. That's nonsense. That is utter nonsense. Yes, they can make whatever political endorsements they want. All they have to do is give up their tax exemption. No problem, right? Well, they don't want to do that because it's far too valuable for them. And so they've been making all these noises about how this is somehow an impingement on their religious freedom and all this stuff. And that's just utter nonsense. But let's play out this scenario a little bit. Donald Trump, as you know, beginning in the 2016 campaign, promised to do away with the Johnson Amendment. He's tried various steps. By the way, I'm not a legal scholar, but it seems to me that it would take an act of Congress to reverse the Johnson Amendment. Not to say that this Congress wouldn't be willing to do that, but I don't think you can reverse that by executive order. But I don't want to get into that legal argument. But let's play this out. All right. If the Johnson Amendment didn't exist, and suppose I had a lot of disposable income, that is several $1 million of disposable income, which I don't.
As
Let's be clear about
professors do,
that.
right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah. All professors want to throw away that kind of money. Yes. And I could go to some big mega church pastor. I want to pick on Joel Osteen for some reason, but maybe that's not fair. But let's say I go down to Houston and I score a meeting with Joel Osteen, and I say, hey, Reverend Osteen, I've got, I don't know, $3 million. Maybe that wouldn't even turn his head. I don't know. But anyway, I got $3 million that I'm willing to give to your church. I've forgotten the name of it for the moment, but there's this big mega church. And all I ask in return is that once a week, you make a fairly positive, complimentary reference to my preferred political candidate for 2028, J.D. Vance or Ted Cruz or Josh Shapiro, whoever it might be. That's all I ask. How is that not money laundering into politics? That makes churches the machine for laundering this money. And I think the other, the more important thing is that it diminishes even further the possibility that people are going to be hearing prophetic witness from the pulpit. If these preachers are essentially for sale to the highest bidder. And we need a prophetic voice in this country right now, like we've never needed in our entire history, it seems to me. And to simply auction those preachers off to the highest bidder is, I think, a very bad idea, to say the least.
Yeah. I wonder if you could speak to education and why our schools have become such battlegrounds for
Yeah.
separation of church and state.
Yeah. That's a great question. Well, I talked about a minute ago about the rather dicey origins of the Johnson Amendment. I think in many ways the so-called Blaine amendments fall into that same category. James Blaine was a politician from Maine. originally a newspaper guy who ran for Congress and eventually became Speaker of the House of Representatives, went on to the Senate and actually served as Secretary of State and was the Republican nominee for president in, I believe, don't hold me to this, 1884, don't hold me to that date, but one of these presidential elections. So he's a very prominent figure. He introduced to Congress what became known as the Blaine Amendment, which prohibited the use of taxpayer money for religious schools. Now, the underside of that is to say that this was directed against Catholics for the support of parochial schools, and we have to reckon with that. Nevertheless, even though the amendment did not win approval in Congress, 37 states adopted some form or another of Blaine amendments to prohibit the use of taxpayer money for public education. And throughout American history, the use of taxpayer funds for religious education has been one of these bright lines marking the separation of church and state. And what we're seeing now is an obliteration of that line with the collusion of the Supreme Court. I like to say that the Supreme Court, I wish the Supreme Court had half as much deference to the First Amendment as it does to the Second Amendment. This worries me. I think this probably worries me much more than even Trump does. The Supreme Court has no deference whatsoever to the First Amendment and to the separation of church and state. And the issue where it's being played out, I think, most visibly is in schools and the use of taxpayer money for religious education. Now, parents have every right to send their students to their children to any school they want, including homeschool. But to have taxpayers support that, religious education in particular, I think is a serious mistake and a clear violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Unfortunately, the majority in the Supreme Court doesn't see it that way, and the various recent rulings, the Espinoza decision, the Macon decision in Maine, really sets us up for a very bad situation. And let me, I'm sorry I keep going on here, but let me go on to say that I think public education is one of the great triumphs of the American experience. Common schools originated in the 19th century. They were called common schools at the time. And they had the support, the overwhelming support of evangelicals, because they understood this as a way for those on the lower rungs of society to become upwardly mobile through education. And in fact, if you look at the leaders of education movements, public school movements in various places in the 19th century, they very often were Protestant ministers who were lending their support to public education. I think public schools are, and I'm a proud alumnus of public education. I claim that proudly. Public schools are the one place in our society where children of different religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, even socioeconomic backgrounds can come together in the classroom, on the playground, learn about what they have in common, understand their differences, but more important, learn how to get along with one another. And that, to me, is the recipe for democracy. And, I'm fully willing to acknowledge that public education hasn't always lived up to those ideals. I understand that. I understand that perfectly well. But it seems to me that if we care about the future of democracy, we can't afford to give up on that ideal. And these school voucher programs, I think, are ruinous to the future of democracy. And there's a cynical process going on here that I really find unsettling. You have these state legislatures that, I have to say it, are dominated by Republicans. And I don't want to be partisan about it, but I have to state the facts. And what they do is they starve public education of funding. And this leads to all sorts of bad things, a kind of a death spiral for public schools. Teachers aren't being paid what they're worth. The morale begins to suffer, and many of them leave. Many of the best ones leave for other professions. And then the legislature circles back 3, 4 years later and does what I call the Chicken Little dance, right? Saying, "Oh, our public schools are failing. We can't let our parents send their children to these failing schools. We have to find another solution." And so they come up with this voucher scheme, which of course is, you know, fully orchestrated by various political forces in Washington, and say this is the answer to these failing public schools. It's a very, very cynical process that they're engaged in, and I fear for the future of public education.
Well, on that happy and optimistic note, the book is. I really hope everyone will check it out. I'll hold up I have my digital copy here, so it's not quite as pretty as the actual book. But America's Best Idea: The Separation of Church and State. And I love Ken Burns. I think his documentary on national parks is great. But I'm going to go Team Balmer here. This is America's Best Idea. Thank you, Randall, so much for writing the book and for joining us here on the program to talk about all of this. We really appreciate it.
It's always my pleasure.